In 1934, there were many notable events such as the shooting of Bonnie and Clyde and the taking of the famous photograph of the Loch Ness Monster. However, there was a desperate tragedy that often goes overlooked, and it was with the cruise liner Morro Castle, 11,520-ton ship owned by Ward Line of America. The ship was handsome in the same way as the Titanic that foundered 22 years earlier. She was originally conceived to be a ferry running between Havana and New York, but it was repurposed as a cruise liner where the passengers could drink imported alcohol and party through the night. The Morro Castle had been sailing towards New York, and on the evening of September 7th, the guests were preparing for their final night, donning their finest outfits and congregating in the main dining room. The captain of the ship would be joining the passengers, and as the passengers waited for his appearance, they wondered if they should start without him. Little did they know that their host, Captain Robert Wilmot, would never grace their company again. He had been discovered slumped in his cabin, dead from a heart attack. The second in command, Chief Officer William Worms, had taken control, and the inevitable rumor mill spread the news to the stunned passengers who, out of respect, returned to their cabins to drink privately. Outside the ship, a strong northeaster was battering the steel hull as it cut through the storm, illuminated by wild lightning strikes. Worms had taken command of the bridge for the first time in his life, and it was around 2 a.m. that the ship was steered in the direction of the Ambrose Light, which marked the primary passage for ships entering New York. The Morro Castle had around 6 hours of sailing left, until it was due to arrive at Pier 13 and the passengers would alight. It was during this final part of the voyage that a night watchman reported to the bridge that smoke was seen billowing out of a ventilator tube. Naturally, an officer was dispatched to investigate, only to be met by a wall of flame issuing from the library. The fire suppression system was controlled by a lever, but when it was pulled, nothing happened. Despite an alarm being raised, the fire was already burning out of control, sending hot embers above the superstructure of the ship that still cut a path through the cruel, dark waters. Unlike the Titanic, the Morro Castle had a full complement of lifeboats, capable of carrying up to 700 passengers and crew. Safety should have been assured for the people on board the cruise liner. However, the crew had different ideas. Of the first 6 lifeboats that fled the inferno and pulled safely into Spring Lake, New Jersey, a head count revealed only 85 people rescued, of whom 80 were crew members. Left behind on the ship was a depleted complement of trained crew members who found themselves overwhelmed by panic-stricken passengers who refused to follow commands. Fighting broke out as passengers desperately tried to get to the lower decks, and most didn't want to run the risk of being burned trying to get in the lifeboats. With heavy hearts, the remaining crew abandoned the ship and sailed away in mostly empty lifeboats, leaving behind the hideous scenes. On deck, the remaining passengers, who were wholly unprepared for the nightmarish scenario, tried to avoid the billowing smoke and flames that rose from the wooden deck. Eventually, they had no choice but to leap into the waters of the North Atlantic and try to cling to anything floating in the murky blackness. There were other mistakes made that night, too. The chief radio operative had sent his assistant to the bridge to request permission for a mayday to be issued. He sat in his operator room deep within the ship, feeling the terrible heat of the fire on the walls. When his assistant returned, the order had been only to stand by. He immediately sent his assistant back to try and get the permission again. It was 1.5 hours after the fire had started when he was finally given that desperately needed authorization. Flames and explosions were occurring beneath his feet as he sent out his final call. SOS. 20 miles south of Scotland Light. Cannot work much longer. Fire directly under radio. Need assistance immediately. No more messages were sent, but this cry for help had been heard. Captain Albert Francis of the vessel Monarch of Bermuda was the closest to her position and steered his ship within sight of the stricken vessel. What befell his eyes was horrific. As flames tore through the ship, passengers trapped in their cabins had tried escaping through narrow portholes. Many were trapped midway out and were in abject agony as they were burnt alive. On the poop deck, flames now engulfed anyone caught in the open. Hours went by and the Morro Castle showed no sign of life except worms and some crew members stationed at the bow. The anchor had been dropped to prevent the vessel from hitting rescue vessels, but she couldn't remain where she was. A Coast Guard cutter offered to take her in tow, but the Morro Castle was powerless and unable to raise its anchor. Two seamen finally hacksawed through the chain, and the process of lifting off the remaining survivors started. Worms was last to leave the vessel and was transferred to the Tampa. With the Morro Castle still burning fiercely, the ship finally made way under tow. The situation deteriorated quickly when the tow lines failed and the ship was left adrift. By the time it came to rest on the coast between New York and Atlantic City, a crowd of 250,000 people milled about on the beach, nearly within touching distance of the burning ship. The inquiry showed the Morro Castle had been allowed to steam at full speed into a steady headwind, which had fanned the flames and worsened the catastrophe. It was said at the trial that Worms had acted like a madman. However, he did not serve any jail time for the event despite 90 passengers and 44 crew members perishing under horrific circumstances. The company was fined $10,000 and settled claims with the surviving passengers. The Morro Castle was finally towed to Baltimore, where it was scrapped for less than $34,000 despite costing over $5 million to build.